The Bitterroot Mountains chew up solitary men and spit out bones. Hebel Montgomery survived the brutal freeze of 1883, expecting nothing but an empty, ice-cold cabin upon his return. Instead, smoke plumed from his chimney, and the scent of roasted venison promised his isolated, predictable world was already dead. The wind howling through the lodgepole pines sounded like a choir of the damned. Hebel Montgomery, a man built like the rugged granite peaks he called home, trudged through knee-deep snow, his pack mule, Barnaby, groaning in protest behind him. Hebel was 32, his face hidden beneath a thick, frost-laden beard, his eyes a pale, piercing gray that missed nothing. He had spent the last 3 weeks deep in the Montana Territory, high country, running trap lines for beaver and marten. His bones ached with a damp, unrelenting cold, and his mind was fixed on one singular, desperate thought: a fire. He didn't expect company. He lived 60 miles from the nearest semblance of civilization, a rough-and-tumble trading post run by an old-timer named Jebediah Miller. Hebel had chosen this isolation purposefully. The world of men was full of noise, deceit, and blood, and he had seen enough of it during his time riding with the cavalry in the Dakotas. But as he crested the final ridge overlooking his small, hidden valley, Hebel stopped dead. Barnaby bumped into his shoulder, snorting a plume of white vapor. There was smoke rising from the stone chimney of his cabin. Instinct, honed by years of survival, took over. Hebel unslung his Winchester 1873 rifle, his thumb resting heavily on the hammer. Trespassers in the deep winter were rarely friendly. They were usually desperate outlaws, starving drifters, or men looking to steal a winter's worth of furs and leave the owner bleeding out in the snow. He tied Barnaby to a frozen pine 100 yards out and approached silently, keeping the wind in his face so the draft wouldn't carry his scent to the cabin's drafty windows. He crept to the heavy oak door, listening. He expected the gruff voices of men, the clinking of stolen whiskey bottles. Instead, he heard the rhythmic, soothing scrape of a wooden spoon against cast iron, and then the smell hit him. It wasn't just wood smoke. It was the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted venison, seasoned with wild thyme, garlic, and something sweet, perhaps the dried huckleberries he kept in jars in the cellar. His stomach let out a violent, traitorous growl. Hebel kicked the door open, the heavy wood slamming against the log wall, his Winchester leveled at chest height. "Don't move a muscle," he bellowed, his voice rough as sandpaper. A glass jar shattered against the floorboards. Standing by the hearth was not a grizzled outlaw. It was a woman. She was small, swallowed entirely by one of Hebel's spare wool flannel shirts, which fell to her knees like a dress. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, framing a face pale with terror and smudged with soot. But what caught Hebel's attention wasn't just her presence. It was the fierce, panicked survival instinct in her eyes. Despite trembling like a leaf, she hadn't raised her hands in surrender. She had snatched up a heavy iron fire poker and was holding it out like a cavalry saber. "Who are you?" Hebel demanded, not lowering his rifle. "How did you get up here?" She swallowed hard, her knuckles white around the iron rod. I was lost. The storm. I found the cabin. Please, put the gun down." Her voice was a raspy whisper, cultured but broken by exhaustion. Hebel stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him to trap the heat. The cabin was warmer than he had felt it in years. The floor was swept. His chaotic pile of provisions had been neatly stacked, and on the potbelly stove, a hearty stew was bubbling away, alongside a fresh pan of sourdough biscuits. He slowly lowered the Winchester, uncocking the hammer. "You're holding my fire poker," he said flatly. She looked at the iron rod, then at the massive, snow-covered man before her, and the fight seemed to instantly drain from her. The poker clattered to the floor. She swayed, her legs giving out, and she collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't steal anything," she sobbed. "I just needed to be warm. I'll leave. I'll pack my things and walk out right now." Hebel looked out the frosted window. The sun was dipping below the peaks, and the temperature was already plummeting towards zero. Sending her out now was a death sentence. "Ain't nobody walking out of here tonight," Hebel grumbled, leaning his rifle against the wall and shrugging off his heavy buffalo hide coat. "What's your name?" She hesitated, looking up at him with tear-streaked eyes. "Abigail," she said. "Abby." "Well, Abby, I'm Hebel. And seeing as you cooked my meat and used my flour," he walked over to the stove, pulling off his frozen leather gloves, "you're going to sit down and eat it with me." That evening, the silence of the cabin was replaced by the clinking of tin plates. Hebel ate like a starving wolf, but he couldn't help but watch her. She had a bruise blooming on her left cheekbone, yellowing at the edges, and her hands were blistered not from mountain work, but from something else. She ate delicately, revealing a refined upbringing that had no business being 5,000 feet up in the bitter roots. She had changed his world in a matter of hours. The cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore. Tonight, it felt like a home. But as Hebel stared at the dark, haunted look in Abigail's eyes, he knew one thing for certain. Trouble had followed her up this mountain, and it was only a matter of time before it knocked on his door. 6 weeks passed, and the bitterroot winter locked them in an icy embrace. The snow drifted up to the windowsills, turning Hebel's cabin into an island in a white sea. In that time, the dynamic between the rugged mountain man and the mysterious runaway shifted from cautious suspicion to a profound, unspoken companionship. Abigail, if that was even her real name, Hebel often wondered transformed his life. She mended his torn canvas trousers with meticulous tiny stitches. She rationed their provisions so effectively that Hebel didn't have to hunt in the most brutal blizzards. In the evenings, while Hebel cleaned his traps or oiled his rifle, she would read aloud from a battered copy of Dickens' Great Expectations she had found on his shelf. Her voice was a melody that chased away the ghosts of his past. Hebel found himself doing things he hadn't done in a decade. He chopped extra wood just to keep her warm. He carved a small wooden comb for her tangled hair out of a piece of smooth cedar. He caught himself smiling when she scolded him for tracking mud across the floorboards. For a man who had sworn off the world, he was dangerously close to falling in love with the woman who had invaded his sanctuary. But Abby never spoke of her past. Whenever Hebel gently pressed her about where she came from, or how she ended up on a deadly mountain pass in the middle of November, her eyes would glaze over with that same terror he saw on the first day. She would retreat into herself, scrubbing the cast-iron pans until her knuckles bled. By late January, they were running perilously low on coffee, salt, and kerosene. The weather broke just enough for Hebel to make a run to Miller's trading post down in the valley. It would take him 3 days round trip. "I don't want you to go," Abby said, standing by the door as he saddled his horse, a nervous tremor in her voice. She gripped the collar of the oversized coat he had given her. "I'll be back before the next front moves in," Hebel promised, his voice softer than usual. He reached out, his rough, calloused thumb gently brushing against her cheek, right where the faded yellow bruise had finally vanished. "Keep the fire hot." The ride down to the valley was brutal, but Hebel pushed through. When he finally pushed open the doors of Miller's trading post, the warm, stale air smelling of tobacco and cheap whiskey washed over him. Jebediah Miller, a balding man with a walrus mustache, looked up from his ledger. "Well, I'll be damned. The ghost of the Bitterroots lives." "Thought the winter got you, Hebel." "Takes more than snow to kill me, Jeb," Hebel grunted, tossing a sack of prime beaver pelts onto the counter. "Need salt, beans, kerosene, and coffee. Real coffee, not that chicory dirt." As Jebediah weighed the pelts, he shook his head. "Crazy times down in the flatlands, Hebel. Trains getting robbed, cattle wars over in Wyoming, and the bounty hunter's place has been crawling with Pinkertons and hired guns the last month." Hebel stiffened. "Pinkertons? Out here?" "Yep. Looking for a woman." Jebediah reached under the counter and pulled out a crumpled, heavy stock wanted poster, sliding it across the wood. "Came all the way from Denver. Caused a hell of a stir. Fella paying the bounty is a railroad tycoon. Richer than God." Hebel looked down at the paper, and the breath left his lungs as if he'd been kicked in the chest by a mule. Staring back at him was a charcoal sketch of the woman currently sitting in his cabin. The aristocratic nose, The shape of the eyes, it was unmistakably her. But the name at the top wasn't Abigail. Wanted dead or alive, Charlotte Lottie Beaumont Bounty. $2,000 in gold coin wanted for the grand theft of $50,000 and the attempted murder of prominent Denver businessman Arthur Pendleton. $2,000. A man could buy a sprawling ranch in California for that kind of money. Men would slaughter entire towns for half that amount. Dangerous little bird, Jebediah muttered, tapping the paper. Pendleton claimed she shot him in the chest while he slept, stole his safe bonds, and fled on a northbound train. They lost her trail near Missoula before the big blizzard hit. Reckon she froze to death out there. Reckon so, Hebel said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He folded the poster with deliberate, steady hands and shoved it into his inner coat pocket. His mind was a roaring storm. Attempted murder? Grand theft? The woman who carefully rescued spiders from the cabin floor instead of squashing them? Hebel gathered his supplies and rode out within the hour, pushing his horse hard against the fading light. The journey back up the mountain was an agonizing battle between his heart and his survival instincts. He was harboring a high-profile fugitive. If the Pinkertons found out, they would burn his cabin to the ground and hang him from the nearest pine for aiding her. Yet, as he thought about Arthur Pendleton, a rich, powerful businessman, and the faded bruise on Charlotte's face, a darker, colder anger began to take root in Hebel's chest. When Hebel finally kicked the cabin door open 2 days later, coated in ice and exhaustion, Charlotte was sitting by the fire, mending a sock. She jumped up, a brilliant, relieved smile breaking across her face. "Hebel, you're safe." Hebel didn't smile back. He dropped the heavy burlap sacks of supplies on the floor with a loud thud. He reached into his coat, pulled out the crumpled wanted poster, and slammed it down onto the wooden dining table. "Dinner smells good, Lottie," Hebel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy growl. "Now, why don't you tell me why I shouldn't tie you to the back of my mule and collect my $2,000? Charlotte stared at the wanted poster resting on the rough-hewn oak table. The color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the snowdrifts against the window panes. Her breathing turned shallow. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the crackle of pitch pine in the hearth. She didn't reach for the skinning knife on the counter. She didn't bolt for the door. Instead, her shoulders slumped, the oversized wool coat swallowing her frame. $2,000, she whispered, her voice hollow. Arthur always believed every problem in the territory could be solved by throwing gold at it. Hebel remained by the door, his massive frame blocking the only exit. His pale gray eyes were hard as flint. He had survived his adult life by trusting his gut, and right now, his instincts were violently at war. The Pinkerton poster declared her a ruthless thief and a killer. But the woman standing before him, the one who had painstakingly nursed a frozen songbird back to health, didn't possess the cold blood of a murderer. "I reckon you better start talking, Lottie," Hebel said, his rumbling baritone carrying no warmth. "And it better be the unvarnished truth, because if the Pinkertons are hunting you, they won't stop at Miller's trading post. They'll pay Jebediah a fortune for my location, and they'll come riding up that ridge." Charlotte closed her eyes, a tear cutting a track down her soot-smudged cheek. "My true name is Charlotte Beaumont. My father, Henry, owned lucrative silver claims near Leadville. We were wealthy, Hebel. Too wealthy. It attracted the wrong kind of men." The fear in her eyes was overshadowed by a deeply entrenched hatred. "Arthur Pendleton isn't just a Denver businessman. He's a ruthless railroad magnate, a shadow partner in Jay Gould's syndicate. He wanted my father's land for the Denver and Rio Grande, but my father refused to sell." Hebel stepped into the room, unbuttoning his buffalo coat. Out west, the railroads were wrathful deities who crushed anything in their path. When Arthur couldn't buy the land legally, he orchestrated a panic, Charlotte continued. He called in fake debts, bribed the assayers, and ruined my father financially. My father's heart couldn't take the shame. He died 2 days after the bank seized our estate. Hebel crossed his arms. "And the $50,000? It wasn't his money," Charlotte flared, slamming her small fist against the table. It was the bearer bonds and the original deeds to our claims. Arthur kept them locked in his Denver mansion. He forced me to move in with him, promising that if I married him, he would let my younger sister live in peace. If I refused, he promised to ruin her, too. Charlotte looked at her calloused hands that used to play the piano in velvet-draped parlors. I lasted 3 weeks. One night, drunk on scotch, he cornered me and tore my dress. I grabbed a silver letter opener and struck him in the shoulder. While he was bleeding, I opened his safe, took my family's deeds, and ran. I rode freezing boxcars north until the lines ended, then walked into the mountains. Hebel looked at her, then at the wanted poster. The law was a purchased commodity. Pendleton could buy a hanging rope before breakfast. Hebel reached across the table, picked up the crumpled poster, and walked to the potbelly stove. Without a word, he tossed the paper directly into the roaring flames. They watched the charcoal sketch curl, blacken, and turn to ash. $2,000 wouldn't buy a single hair on your head, Lottie, Hebel said quietly. But we have a serious problem. The winter is breaking. The brutal deep freeze was yielding to an early spring thaw, meaning the steep mountain passes were no longer impassable. Hebel spent his days preparing for war. He oiled his Winchester 1873 and a double-barreled shotgun. He set tripwires strung with empty tin cans along the trail. Inside, he taught Charlotte the brutal mechanics of the heavy shotgun. "If men come, they won't knock," Hebel warned, watching her load a heavy brass shell. "You don't hesitate. You point, you pull the trigger, and you don't look at their faces." On the 9th morning, the dread broke. Barnaby, the pack mule, let out a panicked bray. Hebel, dozing by the hearth, was awake instantly. He blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Lottie," he hissed. "Root cellar. Now." Charlotte grabbed the shotgun, knuckles white. "I won't let you fight my war alone." Before Hebel could argue, the sharp clink of a tin can echoed from the eastern ridge. Hebel peered through a gap in the heavy window shutters. Out of the thick morning mist, 3 men emerged on spiked snowshoes. Hebel's blood ran ice-cold as the leader stepped into the pale light. He recognized the man from blood-soaked legends whispered across the territory, Deacon Jim Miller, a notorious assassin who claimed to be devout but murdered for a living. Always wearing a heavy black frock coat and carrying a modified Sharps buffalo rifle. Pendleton hadn't just put a bounty on Charlotte. He had guaranteed her execution. 3 of them, Hebel whispered, racking his Winchester. "The one in black is Jim Miller, a professional killer. If I fall, Lottie, you shoot him, and you don't stop until the gun is empty." The assault began without a single word of warning, tearing through the quiet dawn. A heavy slug from Deacon Jim Miller's modified Sharps buffalo rifle obliterated the solid oak of the cabin door like it was constructed of dry parchment. The bullet shattered a ceramic pitcher on the counter and embedded itself deep into the log wall, showering the room in splinters. The concussive boom echoed across the Bitterroot Valley, silencing the morning birds. Hebel didn't flinch. He kicked open the heavy wooden window shutter, leveled his Winchester 1873, and fired twice into the thick morning mist. A scream pierced the cold air as one of Miller's hired thugs took a 44-40 round to the shoulder, spinning him violently into a melting snowdrift. "Flank him, you fools!" Miller's voice barked out from the tree line, calm, rhythmic, and utterly devoid of fear. "Burn the cabin to the ground if you have to." Bullets rained against the cabin, splintering wood and shattering the remaining frosted glass. Hebel moved with the fluid, deadly grace of a man who had survived the brutal Indian wars under General Crook. He fired, moved, and fired again, keeping the men pinned behind the thick trunks of the lodgepole pines. But Miller was a master tactician. While Hebel was entirely focused on the 2 armed thugs rushing the front, Miller had vanished like a ghost into the white haze. Suddenly, the back window of the cabin exploded inward. Shards of glass rained down on Charlotte. A man's upper body shoved through the frame, a heavy Colt revolver in his hand, aiming blindly into the dim room. Charlotte screamed, But Hebel's training over the past week took over her panic. She didn't hesitate or freeze. She raised the heavy double-barreled shotgun, squeezed her eyes shut to brace against the flash, and pulled the front trigger. The massive recoil knocked her flat onto her back, bruising her shoulder against the floorboards, but the blast was devastatingly effective. The man in the window was thrown backward into the slush, his weapon clattering uselessly onto the floor. "Lottie, are you hit?" Hebel roared, ducking as another volley of hot lead chewed through the front wall, showering his hat with wood dust. "I'm all right," she cried out, her ears ringing violently as she scrambled to her knees, her trembling hands instinctively reaching to reload the empty breech. Hebel turned his attention back to the front. The surviving thug made a desperate, sliding run for the lean-to, hoping to use Barnaby the mule for cover. Hebel tracked him down the iron sights of the Winchester, let out a slow, measured breath, and squeezed the trigger. The man dropped instantly in the snow, lifeless. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the clearing, thick with the acrid scent of sulfur and burnt gunpowder. "Miller!" Hebel shouted out into the mist, his voice a gravelly threat. "Your boys are dead. You're out in the cold. Ride away now, and you keep your miserable life." A low, chilling laugh echoed from the edge of the tree line. "A mountain man giving me terms? That's a rich joke. I don't leave a contract unfinished, Montgomery." Before Hebel could track the direction of the voice, the remains of the cabin door were kicked completely off their iron hinges. Deacon Jim Miller stood in the doorway, his signature black frock coat billowing despite the lack of wind, aiming a Colt revolver straight at Hebel's chest. Hebel swung his rifle, but the notorious assassin was terrifyingly fast. Crack. Pain, hot and blinding, erupted in Hebel's left shoulder. The impact spun the massive mountain man around, dropping him heavily to his knees as the Winchester slipped from his numb grasp. Blood immediately began pouring down his arm, soaking his flannel shirt in crimson. Miller stepped into the ruined cabin, a cruel, triumphant smile hidden beneath his dark mustache. He cocked the hammer of his revolver, pointing it casually down at Hebel's head. "Nothing personal, mountain man. Just a matter of commerce for Mr. Pendleton." From the shadows of the kitchen, Charlotte stepped forward. Her hands were no longer shaking. The shotgun was leveled squarely at Miller's chest. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice dropping an octave, possessing a steely resolve that mirrored the harsh granite mountains surrounding them. Miller chuckled, not taking his cold eyes off Hebel. "Little Charlotte, Arthur said you had fire. Go ahead and shoot, sweetheart. I'm wearing a hardened steel breastplate under this coat. You'll just make me angry." It was a widely known frontier legend. Deacon Jim Miller wore a heavy steel plate sewn into his coat to stop bullets. Many lawmen had died shooting him squarely in the chest, only to watch him laugh and return lethal fire. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. She didn't lower the heavy weapon. "I know. My father read all about you in the Denver papers." Instead of aiming at his chest, she lowered the barrels of the shotgun by 2 feet, aiming directly at Miller's knees. Miller's smug expression vanished in a flash of realization. "Wait." Charlotte pulled the trigger. At close range, the heavy buckshot obliterated Miller's right kneecap. The assassin let out a blood-curdling howl, his leg giving out completely. He collapsed onto the wooden floorboards in a heap, dropping his revolver as he clutched his ruined leg in pure agony. Hebel, fighting through the haze of pain in his shoulder, lunged forward with his good arm. He snatched Miller's fallen revolver and brought the heavy steel butt down hard on the assassin's temple. Miller slumped over, unconscious and bleeding out onto the floor. The battle was over. Charlotte dropped the shotgun and fell to her knees beside Hebel, her hands frantically pressing against his bleeding shoulder. Tears streamed down her face, washing away the black gunpowder residue. "Hebel, I'll get the bandages. I'll fix this. I'm all right, Lottie." Hebel gritted his teeth, his hand reaching up to touch her face, wiping away a tear with his blood-stained thumb. Passed clean through the meat. Over the next hour, Charlotte worked with desperate efficiency, cleaning the wound with boiling water and whiskey. As the adrenaline faded, a stark, crushing reality set in. Hebel sat by the fire, looking at the shattered remains of his sanctuary. "He won't stop Hebel," Charlotte said softly, staring into the flames. "When Miller doesn't return, Arthur Pendleton will send an army. As long as he thinks I'm alive, he will hunt me." Hebel looked at the cabin he had built with his own 2 hands, then at the aristocratic girl who had just crippled one of the deadliest men in the West for him. "Then he won't think you're alive," Hebel said quietly. Charlotte looked at him, confused. "We leave Miller and his boys out in the snow," Hebel explained, his mind working quickly. "We take their horses. We leave your wool coat and that silver locket you wear in the blood by the door. When Pendleton's men finally brave the pass, they'll assume Miller killed you, and I killed Miller before bleeding out myself. They'll find the blood and the locket. Pendleton will close the book. But your home, Hebel," she whispered. Hebel pulled her close. "A home is just wood and stone, Lottie. It ain't worth a damn if it's empty." By nightfall, they had packed the mule and saddled Miller's surviving horses. They left the cabin looking like a frozen tomb. As they rode up the crest of the northern ridge, the winter moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the endless expanse of the wilderness, stretching out toward the Canadian border. Hebel looked back one final time, but for the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel lonely at all. He turned his horse north, riding into the great unknown alongside the woman who had brought the fire back into his soul. The brutal bitterroots had chewed them up, but instead of bones, it spat out an alliance of iron and fire. Hebel abandoned the only home he knew, but looking at Charlotte riding proudly beside him toward the Canadian border, he finally realized the absolute truth. The mountain cabin was never his true sanctuary. She was. He had returned home that snowy winter, and the mysterious girl had changed his world.